Without my signature, this restaurant doesn't exist. My stepfather said it like a verdict, leaning back in the leather chair that used to be my father's, his voice carrying easily across the conference room. The lawyer beside him shuffled his papers and didn't look at me. My mother sat with her hands folded so tightly her knuckles had gone white, staring at the table like it might answer for her. I am 31 years old, and I had just watched the man who replaced my father try to take the one thing my father built with his own hands. My name doesn't matter yet. What matters is that 6 months earlier I buried my father, and 4 months after that, I watched my mother remarry a man named Russell Brandt, a man who smiled with his mouth but never with his eyes. Before I tell you how this ends, let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And if you've ever had someone try to take what was never theirs to begin with, hit subscribe, because this story is for you. My father, Thomas, spent 26 years building Founder's Table, a steakhouse on the corner of Bell and Hancock in our little corner of Ohio, the kind of place where the same families came every anniversary, where the bartender knew your order before you sat down. He started it with a loan from his own father and a recipe for au jus that he never wrote down anywhere, not even for me, because he said some things should live in your hands, not on paper. I grew up in that kitchen. I peeled potatoes at the prep counter while he barked orders that always softened the second they reached me. I learned to read a balance sheet before I learned to drive. By the time I was 28, I was running the back office, the inventory, the vendor contracts, everything except the dining room floor, because my father liked to keep that for himself. He liked greeting people. He liked being the face of something he'd made from nothing. He died on a Tuesday in March. A heart attack in the walk-in freezer found by the morning prep cook. I was the one who had to call my mother. I was the one who had to stand in that freezer 2 days later and make myself walk in and out of it without falling apart, because the restaurant didn't stop needing inventory just because the man who built it was gone. My mother, Eleanor, had been married to my father for 34 years. I won't pretend their marriage was a fairy tale. There were long stretches where my father worked 16-hour days and my mother sat alone in a house that felt too big and too quiet. I understood, even as a kid, that she carried a kind of loneliness my father never quite saw. So when Russell showed up 4 months after the funeral, charming and attentive and endlessly available in a way my father had never had the time to be, I told myself I understood that too. I told myself grief makes people reach for anything warm. What I didn't understand, not at first, was how fast Russell moved. He proposed within 3 months, my mother said yes within a week. And by the time the wedding happened in a backyard ceremony with rented white chairs and a string quartet my mother had always wanted and never gotten, Russell had already found a way to get himself named as a co-signer on 3 of the restaurant's vendor accounts. He told my mother it was just practical, that someone needed to help her manage things now that Thomas was gone, that grief makes people vulnerable to bad decisions and he didn't want her exploited. He never once asked me. I ran the back office. I held the inventory contracts, the lease, every operational document that mattered. But Russell didn't bother asking the daughter who actually knew the business. He went straight to the grieving widow who would sign anything to feel less alone. I should have seen it sooner. I think some part of me did and didn't want to look directly at it. The way you don't look directly at the sun even when you know it's there, burning a hole through everything. The trouble really started at a dinner 6 weeks after the wedding. Russell had invited his daughter from a previous marriage, a woman named Whitney, and her husband, a man who introduced himself as a business consultant, and spent the entire meal talking about margin optimization like he was auditioning for a job nobody had offered him. My mother had set the table with my father's good china, the set he bought her for their 20th anniversary, and I remember sitting there thinking how strange it was to watch strangers eat off my father's plates while talking about my father's restaurant like it was an asset class. The thing about Founder's Table, Russell said, swirling wine he hadn't paid for in a glass that wasn't his, is that it's sitting on prime real estate and running at maybe 60% of its potential margin. Thomas ran it with his heart. Nothing wrong with that, rest his soul. But a business needs a head, not just a heart. I set my fork down very carefully. The restaurant is profitable, Russell. It's been profitable every year since it opened. Profitable isn't the same as optimized, Whitney said, like she was quoting a textbook she'd half read. Dad says there's a real opportunity here if the right people are given the right access. I looked at my mother. She was looking at her plate. What kind of access? I asked. Russell smiled the smile that didn't reach his eyes. Eleanor and I have been talking. As her husband, and given that she's the surviving spouse, it makes sense for me to take a more active role, help modernize things. You've done an admirable job holding things together, but you're, what, 31? You've never run a restaurant on your own. I have an MBA and 15 years in operations consulting. I think we'd all sleep easier if there were an adult in the room with real experience. An adult in the room. I was 31 years old and I had been running the financial backbone of that restaurant for 3 years while my father was alive, and every day since he died. But none of that mattered to Russell, because in his mind, I wasn't the daughter who'd built half her life into that building. I was an obstacle standing between him and a steakhouse he'd decided he was entitled to. I didn't argue at the table. I'd learned a long time ago in business school and in 8 years of mergers and acquisitions work, I never bothered to mention to my stepfather that the people who win arguments at dinner are rarely the people who win in the end. I smiled, I said I'd think about it, and I went home and called my attorney. Here is the thing Russell never bothered to learn, because he never bothered to ask. Founder's Table was never solely owned by my father. 11 years earlier, when I finished my MBA at Ohio State and came back home, instead of taking a job at a private equity firm in Chicago, my father restructured the business into an LLC. He gave me 30% ownership that day, sitting in the same booth where I now sit and review quarterly numbers, and he told me it was because he wanted me to have skin in the game I was already giving my whole life to. We never told my mother the exact percentages, because my father was old-fashioned about money and marriages, and frankly he didn't think it was anyone's business but ours. When he died without updating his will to reflect a remarriage he never lived to see, his 51% share passed not to my mother outright but into a trust, with my mother as the income beneficiary and me as the trustee, exactly the structure he'd set up after his first cardiac scare 4 years earlier when he told me very plainly that he trusted my judgment more than he trusted anyone's grief. Russell did not know this. He assumed that because my mother was the widow, she controlled everything. He assumed wrong, and he was about to find out exactly how wrong in the worst possible setting. It was Whitney's idea, I found out later, to push for an emergency meeting with the restaurant's accountant to review the books and discuss management restructuring. Russell sent the invite himself, seeing the family lawyer, a man named Gerald Finch, who Russell had hired the week after the wedding, a man who'd clearly been told a story about a grieving widow and a controlling stepdaughter standing between her and the life she deserved. They scheduled it for a Thursday morning at the restaurant's accountant's office downtown. They did not invite me to help plan it. They simply expected me to show up and be managed. I showed up early. I sat in the parking lot in my car for 10 minutes, looking at the building, thinking about my father standing in that same lot the day he signed the lease for the original space, 26 years ago, telling me, even though I was only 5 and barely listening, that someday this would matter to somebody. I think he meant me. I don't think he ever imagined it would mean fighting off a man he never met. Inside, Russell sat at the head of the conference table like he'd already won, his lawyer to his right, my mother to his left looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. Whitney sat across from me with a legal pad and an expression like she was about to deliver a TED Talk. "Thank you for coming," Russell said like he was hosting. "I know this is a difficult time for everyone, and I want to be sensitive to that. But the truth is, this business needs structure, and frankly, needs someone with real executive experience steering the ship. I've prepared a proposal." He slid a folder across the table. I didn't open it. "The short version is that I'd take over as managing partner, with your mother's full backing as majority owner, and you'd remain in an operational support role. Bookkeeping, inventory, the things you're already good at. I think it's a fair compromise that honors your father's legacy while bringing this place into the modern era. Without my signature, this restaurant doesn't exist," he added, leaning back, watching me the way a man watches something he's already decided he owns. "I've spoken with counsel. As Eleanor's husband and the practical head of this household, my involvement going forward isn't really optional. It's necessary." I let the silence sit for a moment. I'd learned that too in 8 years of deal rooms where men twice my age tried to talk over numbers they hadn't read. Silence makes people nervous. Nervous people talk too much and reveal too much. "Gerald," I said finally, looking at the lawyer instead of Russell, "did you pull the LLC operating agreement before drafting this proposal?" Gerald blinked. "I was told Brandt was the majority owner following her husband's passing." "You were told wrong," I reached into my bag and slid my own folder across the table, the one I'd had prepared for 11 days, ever since that dinner with Whitney and her husband talking about margin optimization like vultures, circling something that wasn't dead yet. My father restructured Founder's Table into an LLC 11 years ago. I hold 30% outright in my own name as I have since I was 20 years old. The remaining 51%, my father's share, did not pass to my mother as a personal asset. It passed into the Caldwell Family Trust, established the same year, with my mother as income beneficiary, entitled to distributions for her support and comfort, and me as sole trustee, with full authority over business decisions, hiring, partnership structure, and operational control. That structure has not changed because my father did not update it before he died, and frankly, Russell, even if he had lived another 50 years, that trust requires a court order to amend, not a wedding. The room went very quiet. My mother looked up at me for the first time since I'd walked in, and I saw something in her face I hadn't expected. Not anger, relief maybe, mixed with something closer to shame. "That's not possible," Russell said, but his voice had lost its smoothness. "Eleanor is his widow, spousal rights apply to marital assets and probate estate," I said. "This was never part of the probate estate. It was already in trust, structured specifically, I'd guess, because my father knew exactly how vulnerable my mother might be someday to someone who married fast and moved faster. I don't think he was thinking of you specifically, Russell. I think he just knew people." Whitney's pen had stopped moving entirely. "So what you're telling us," Russell said slowly, like he was trying to find a crack in something that had no cracks, "is that you control 81% of this restaurant." "I'm telling you, I own 30% outright and control 100% of decision-making authority over my father's 51% as trustee, which functionally means yes. You've spent the last 6 weeks trying to negotiate a management takeover with a woman who has zero legal authority to grant you one, and the woman who does have that authority is sitting right here, and she has not been managing partner of anything since the day my father died." I closed my folder. "I appreciate that you have an MBA, Russell. I have one too, along with 8 years at a private equity firm in Chicago doing distressed asset restructuring before I came home to help my father run this place, which you would have known if you'd ever once asked me a single question about my career. Instead of assuming I spent my days doing inventory because I lacked anything better to do with my life." I watched the color drain out of his face the way water drains from a tub, slow and then all at once. "Eleanor," Russell said, turning to my mother, his voice tightening into something less charming. "You need to talk to her. This is absurd. This is your husband's company, our family's future." "It was never your husband's company, Russell," my mother said quietly, and her voice was steadier than I'd heard it in months. "It was Thomas's, and apparently he knew exactly what he was doing when he set it up this way, because I sat here for 6 weeks listening to you talk about steering ships and optimizing margins. And I never once heard you ask what my daughter actually wanted, what she'd already built, or whether either of us even wanted what you were offering." I want to tell you I felt triumphant in that moment. Mostly I felt tired, the particular exhaustion of having spent 11 days preparing for a fight I never should have had to fight, against a man who'd known my mother for less than a year and decided that was enough time to claim something my father spent 26. The accountant's office cleared out faster than it had filled. Gerald Finch packed his folder with the apologetic haste of a man realizing he'd been hired under false pretenses and would not be sending an invoice that included today's meeting. Whitney left without saying anything at all, her legal pad blank except for notes that no longer mattered. Russell tried for a few minutes to recover something, some version of charm, telling my mother they'd talk at home, but she didn't move from her chair and eventually he left alone. My mother stayed behind with me in that conference room for almost an hour. She cried, the kind of crying that comes from a place much older than the last 6 weeks, and she told me she'd known, somewhere underneath the loneliness, that she'd moved too fast, that Russell's attention had felt like oxygen after a year of grief that left her gasping, and that she'd let herself stop asking questions because the answers might have meant going back to being alone. I didn't tell her she'd been foolish. I'd watched grief do strange things to people, including, if I'm honest, to myself in those first months, when I nearly sold my share of the restaurant to a national steakhouse chain just to stop feeling the weight of it every single day. We are not so different, my mother and I, in how badly we wanted someone or something to make the grief make sense. The marriage didn't survive the year. I won't pretend that was my doing, not directly. But once Russell understood there was no business to inherit, no margin to optimize, no ship that needed steering with him at the helm, his attention to my mother thinned out fast, the way attention does when it was never really about the person at all. By the following spring, my mother filed for divorce. I helped her find a lawyer who actually represented her interests instead of someone else's ambitions. The prenuptial agreement Russell had insisted on, ironically, protected her more than he expected. Since he'd drafted it, assuming he'd be the one walking away with something, he walked away with considerably less than he'd hoped, and a reputation in town that followed him out of 3 different consulting contracts over the next 2 years, because Ohio is a smaller world than people like Russell ever seem to believe. I kept running Founder's Table. I expanded it, eventually, the way my father always said he wanted to but never had the capital or the courage to risk. We opened a second location 18 months later, in a renovated mill building 40 minutes north, and I named the private dining room there after him, a small brass plaque by the door that just says Thomas's room, because some things deserve to live in a place people can touch, not just in paperwork. My mother comes in every Sunday now. She sits at the same table near the window, the one my father used to call hers, even though she rarely visited during business hours when he was alive. Too busy, she said, giving him space to be the version of himself he loved being. Now she comes for lunch and stays through the dinner rush sometimes, talking to regulars who remember my father, helping the new hostess learn which families like which booths. I think she's trying to make up for lost time, not with him, because that's gone, but with the place he loved. And maybe with the daughter, she nearly let a stranger sideline out of her own inheritance. I think about that conference room sometimes, the way Russell's voice sounded so sure of itself right up until it wasn't. I think about how easily people mistake quiet for weakness, how a 31-year-old woman who spends her days checking inventory and balancing books can look, to someone like Russell, like a person with nothing real behind her, instead of someone who learned, the hard way, that the people who actually hold the power are rarely the ones performing it loudest in the room. My father used to say that the best recipes are the ones nobody can steal because they were never written down. I think he meant more than au jus. I think he meant the kind of trust you build slowly over decades with the people who show up and do the work when nobody's watching. Russell wanted to inherit a legacy in 6 weeks. He never understood that legacies aren't assets you marry into. They're built one Tuesday at a time, one balance sheet at a time. One quiet decade of showing up, until the day someone tries to take it from you and finds out it was never theirs to take at all. If you've ever had to fight for something that was rightfully yours, something someone else assumed they could simply walk in and claim, I want to hear about it. Tell me in the comments. And remember, the loudest person in the room is rarely the one who actually holds the power.